The assisted dying bill in the UK is getting a lot of traction at the minute, and I think that's a cause for concern because this is a very slippery slope. And we're going to look at Canada, the rapid and overwhelming changes that have been made to the law around assisted suicide in just the span of a few short years. We're going to see them as a case study and an example of why we can't afford to remove these safeguards around this thing. So here we are on the Canadian state website about this. The original made medical assistance in dying is what that stands for. The legislation came in 2016. I thought this was a helpful infographic, but it's not super high res, so bear with me on this. Hopefully you can read it. So originally the process you would have to go through this was that you'd have to request it, and the eligibility criteria said that you had to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition and that natural death must be reasonably foreseen. That has then since expanded, and the reason it has expanded is because that wasn't super clear guidance. They're very vague, subjective terms, and in a medical sense, it's really hard to tell if death is reasonably foreseeable. And so the current eligibility criteria, which came into force, says here March 17th, 2021, you have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. So that's still a factor, but grievous is a hard one to define. What is grievous for one person might not be grievous for another person. Irremediable, whenever it gets into the mental health, we'll get to that because that's where this is heading towards. It's very hard to know. You can see here the reasonable foreseeability of natural death criterion has been repealed. So essentially you don't have to be terminally ill anymore. In the UK, they're saying the current legislation is that if you are expected to die within 6 months, then you will qualify for it, but nobody really knows. Like, you can't say for certain. Whenever somebody's terminally ill, there's no countdown clock that goes on them that it's like, okay, you've 6 months left, now you can apply for this. It's not a very concrete area. So here's what is really interesting. There's been a push to legalise medical assistance in dying in Canada for people who are mentally unwell, and this has been sort of like temporarily pushed back until 2027 when they're gonna, I suppose, make a decision about it. Certainly at the minute it's looking like it's going to come in 2027 unless that can be sort of stopped, but that is the trajectory it's on. You've got safeguards for all eligible persons. Those safeguards for eligible persons whose death is reasonably foreseeable, they have been eased a little bit, and then they've brought in safeguards, new and strengthened safeguards for eligible persons whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. These new safeguards, obviously they're new safeguards because it's a new category of people who are going to qualify. Final consent to be provided before the administration of it. This has remained, but in the case of, let's jump over and have a wee look. In the case of if somebody is developing Alzheimer's, that's currently a grey area, because I think the phrase that's used is advanced directives, where you say, okay, if I develop Alzheimer's, once I get past a certain stage, I want medical assistance in dying, I want assisted suicide, even if I'm not really capable at that time of making that decision. And that's probably a while off if that is going to come in, but the fact that that's even part of the conversation is really quite scary. Let's have a look at what some people have said about this. So in all of this, I recognize the awfulness of terminal illness and degenerative diseases. I'm not unfamiliar with that in loved ones, and it really is awful. So much of the driving force behind this is pointing to like individual cases that really are horrendously tragic and saying, in this instance, it would be so much better for this person if assisted suicide was legalized. The problem comes whenever you open that up to society and the impact that it has, not just on one individual, but on a society of people, because it might be beneficial, or be deemed beneficial for a person who is really terminally ill and suffering a lot, and they're maybe a couple of months away from death, but want to die before they go further down that path that there's no coming back up from. The issue comes, and we'll look at some stats here, whenever you have people who feel pressured in some way or feel some sort of obligation to die. The phrase that gets thrown around is that the right to die becomes a duty to die, and we're going to look at why that's not just a wee slogan that gets thrown out. It's not a hypothetical. There are cases behind this. There's not, because it's so recent, there's not like a 10-year study on this in Canada, because it's sort of ever changing and ever expanding. It's a complicated field, but let's look at some of what some people are saying. Critics of it in Britain have said about, okay, there are issues here, things about difficulties in defining who is eligible, the danger of people being pressured into a decision, and subsequent attempts to widen the law. Difficulties in determining who is eligible. We're seeing this in Canada when the big question is people with mental illness, in or out, can they get it? Can they not get it? It's a really, even with all of the experts working to create these frameworks and safeguards, it's really hard to create safeguards that work for everybody, and which people can't point at and say, this is unfairly excluding this category of people. So whenever it came in that, like in Canada, that you had to be terminally ill, then there are people who are suffering perhaps more than those who are terminally ill, and their condition is irremediable, but it's not going to bring about immediate death. They can turn around and say, and I suppose did turn around and say, we're being excluded from this. We have just as much right as that person. And then it gets widened. And then the person with the mental illness is saying, well, why can I not do this? And it becomes a really slippery slope. Okay, so Quebec in Canada, officials there have requested an amendment to the criminal code that would permit people to consent to medically assisted death before the onset of conditions like Alzheimer's. So there, look, you have that people who don't have Alzheimer's yet saying that if I develop Alzheimer's, if I get to a certain point, then I want medical assistance in dying. I want assisted suicide. That's scary, because what if you say, I want it at that point, and you get to that point and suddenly you say, no, I don't want it anymore. Like, do you have the insight and the capability to make that decision at that time, or to revoke your previous decision? It's a minefield. There have been a load of really prominent cases. This is a very famous one where a Canadian veteran was asking for a wheelchair ramp in her home, and she was offered assisted suicide. Other ones where there was a lady who had really bad allergies and a medical, I can't remember the exact phrase for it, but was very sensitive to substances, and her housing wasn't really adequate. It had been habitated by people who had smoked previously, and so this was making a really unbearable living condition for her. And so after years of appeals and writing letters and trying to reach out to various officials and government and say, look, I need better housing, she didn't get anywhere, and so she medically ended her own life. There's another one, the family of Alan Nichols. He died by euthanasia. Cited hearing loss as the sole criterion for going for that. Says they investigated it, but that Mr. Nichols met the criteria for assisted death. Now, we need to be careful how much emphasis we place on these individual cases, because in every law, in any good law, there are going to be misapplications of it, and if that misapplication is used to just totally do away with the law or change the law, it's not always helpful. However, the prevalence of instances like this are sort of should raise a red flag about about the practice. So if this was just a one-off case, you'd say, look, that's really unfortunate and tragic, but no system is perfect. If there are a lot of these cases coming up, then it's like, okay, well, maybe the issue is the system. And looking at this report that came out in 2022, the annual report on Canada's medical assistance in dying, here are the reasons that people cited for going ahead with MAID. They were able to tick more than one, so that's why it doesn't add up to, it adds up to way more than 100%. So 86% of people, loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities. I know things like going out for coffee, going on holiday, that like going to the park with your grandkids, that sort of thing. Loss of ability to perform activities of daily living, I believe is what ADL stands for. So going to the toilet, having a shower, brushing your own teeth, washing your own hair, cooking your own food. These are things which, like make bring certain quality to your life, which in the case of terminal illness, those things are lost. We've got inadequate pain control, loss of dignity, inadequate control of symptoms other than pain. But look at this one, 35.3% of people cited perceived burden on family, friends, or caregivers. That's more than a third. It's more than a third of people cited at least one of the reasons was that they feel like they're a burden on their family, and whether that is a burden of care or a financial burden. And that is the scary thing. That's the thing that should really be raising red flags for people, because people are people to be loved, not problems to be solved. If someone is going through this, they're not a problem that you have to sort of manage. They're a person who needs to be treated with care and respect and love, who, like, in the same way that you look after your kids. I wipe my daughter's bum and I bath her, do all of those things. Once you pass a certain age or lose a certain amount of ability, then oftentimes it's your kids having to do that for you. And that's the way that life is. It doesn't mean that those later years are not valuable, and it doesn't mean that they can't be made enjoyable, but to feel that you are a burden on your family, friends, or caregivers, and so you just want to die, that is surely a failure of a society to properly care for people in that situation and at that stage of life. Here we see in that article we looked at a second ago, the next battleground in the expansion of MAID is the inclusion of people with chronic mental illness. So people with mental illness perhaps coming forward and saying, look, we are suffering just like the terminally ill, just like the not terminally ill, but the chronically physically unwell. Why can't we apply for this? So here's what, again, much of the arguments for this just come from appealing to our sense that suffering and death is wrong, and the trajectory towards that, everything that entails, is wrong, and so people should be able to end it. A competent person, I've highlighted way too much there. A competent person with a mental disorder who's suffering terribly and persistently should be able to decide how they will choose to proceed with their life. Even the language of that Senator Stan Kutcher, the language that the senator uses is so beating around the bush. Choose to proceed with their life, let's call it what it is. But then this person is a politician. To deny them this right while permitting it for people whose illness is not a mental disorder is not just stigmatizing, it is exclusionary. So, and this is part of my concern for the UK, that presently the law is the specific thing that would be being brought in is medically assisted suicide, where the doctor, so to speak, prepares the pills and then hands them to you, and they have to be self-administered. But that naturally then excludes people who are perhaps quadriplegic and have no control of their arms and legs. So then if it is allowed for people, if currently it goes through, then it's not really much of a stretch to say, well, people who have no control of their arms and limbs, they can't take it, they can't self-administer, but they have equal rights to it. The law is currently discriminating against them, and so more protections get taken away. It goes from medically assisted suicide to euthanasia, where one person uses medical intervention to end another person's life. That is the way that this goes, and at the minute, the reason that hasn't happened is because euthanasia assisted suicide is illegal in the UK. But once that is taken away, it's sort of a free-for-all. And here's a statement from the Association for Palliative Medicine in the UK of Great Britain and Ireland. It's one of the world's largest representative bodies for people who are for professionals practicing or interested in palliative medicine. Membership of just over 1,400, which isn't a lot, but I guess that maybe reflects, I suppose, the hard nature of palliative care, that there's not a big queue of people to get into it, but also perhaps maybe reflects that it is underfunded and undervalued. They've shown here 2015, 2019, 2020, 2022, the vast majority of their members oppose assisted dying. 2015 it was 82%, 2022 75% said of Scottish members wouldn't be willing to participate in it, and 98% said that it shouldn't be part of mainstream healthcare. Here are the reasons that they gave, and these are reasons that we've touched on when we maybe look at a bit more in the future. Protection of vulnerable, frail, elderly, disabled and terminally ill people. The lack of adequately funded and equally available specialist palliative care services in all areas of the UK. This is a big one. Depending on where you live, you might get good palliative care or you might not. And so if you live in one of those areas, maybe a more poor deprived area where you don't have access to good palliative care, well, you're probably going to go for some form of assisted suicide. I'm trying to resist calling it assisted dying, even though that's the language that is popularly used at the minute. But I think that particular language is more pro than against, and it softens it. It's assisted dying rather than assisted suicide, because suicide naturally and rightly comes with a lot of negative connotations that we want to push back against. You've also got concerns about trust and the impact on doctor-patient relationships. I talked about that in the previous video. Essentially, at the minute you can go to a doctor and assume this person is going to do what they can to promote life here, to protect my life. But if suddenly there's a stream of healthcare where they're going to end your life, that complicates the relationship. And to bring this in on sort of like a Christian worldview, much of that obviously was it could be secular, so to speak. It could be anyone believing those things. But I think we as Christians have a particular perspective to bring to this, because much of the opposition to this is about its opposition to death, opposition to the idea of dying, not just physical death, but the slow crawl towards death, where you experience death in your social life, a death in your ability to do the things that you once enjoyed, a death of your sense of humor, your ability to eat and enjoy food. You experience death in all of these different areas, and then that culminates in your physical bodily death. And so we as Christians, we recognize that that is bad, but we offer hope in death. The trajectory of this creation is not just towards death, but it's sort of through death into life. And here are two really awesome passages in Scripture, one Old Testament, one New Testament, that kind of, well, the New Testament one draws on the Old Testament one. They sort of orient our perspective on death, whereby we see it for what it is, I guess a temporary setback. This is Isaiah 25. On this mountain, it's let me wind back. It's a vision, eschatological vision of the future, vision of like the new creation. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. This is like a post-death existence where we've passed through death into eternal life, and where death previously swallowed people up. It swallowed up from us our ability to enjoy things, our ability to endure, our ability to enjoy anything without the sort of overhanging shroud or sheet or idea that we're going to lose this someday. That gets swallowed up forever. And the Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He'll remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. This is what the Lord has in store for us post-death. And then we look to Revelation 21, where heaven and earth come together. Heaven being God's space, earth being human space. They are reunited, like humans and God dwell together again. It says God's dwelling place is now among the people. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. That's the culmination of just like so many Bible passages. That's that phrase, they will be his people, God will be their God. It's everywhere in the Bible. It says he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. It's drawn right on that, Isaiah 25. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. This is where we are heading as Christians, and so it has a profound impact on how we think about death, how we view death, not as like a gradual stripping away of everything that matters until there's nothing left and it all just sucks. But yeah, a temporary setback is maybe a good way to think about it, because death is the means by which we enter into eternal life. And so that, I think, gives people hope in death, that what they're experiencing and what they're going through is not the last word. It's not irreversible. It's not meaningless. It actually is going to be redeemed and restored and fixed someday. I think that's pretty good. That is what the world sort of is looking for, something to help us overcome death and all that pertains to death. And yeah, I think we as Christians have that. Here's my previous video on this. I'll stick it here somewhere. If you're interested, then you can check that out. But look, thanks for being here, and I will see you soon. God bless.